The Galactic Overlords mocked him until he showed them Earth's final secret welcome to the world of science fiction. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The chamber was suffocating in its grandeur, a cathedral of cold authority, where the rulers of the galaxy sat upon their crystalline thrones watching him, as one might watch a fly trapped within a glass. Ethan Drake, the sole human presence in the tribunal hall of the Galactic Overlords, stood firm, his stance that of a man who knew he was doomed yet refused to bend beneath the weight of inevitability. His diplomatic uniform, pressed in pristine when he had arrived, now bore the evidence of the long, harrowing journey that had led him to this moment. Creases from a dozen sleepless nights, the faint smell of recycled air from the countless ships he had traveled in, and the unmistakable aura of desperation that clung to him like a second skin. He could feel the eyes of hundreds upon him, each overlord a titan in their own right, their elongated bodies adorned with ceremonial armor, their gazes brimming with centuries of unchallenged power. Some regarded him with mild curiosity, others with thinly veiled disdain, but most simply looked past him, as if he were already an irrelevance, a footnote in history that had yet to be written. Ethan's throat was dry, his heartbeat a steady drum of defiance against his ribcage, but he willed himself to speak, his voice, though horror carried across the chamber, with the precision of a man who had prepared every syllable, who had spent weeks crafting the exact sequence of words that might buy his people a future. The war you threaten against Earth is a mistake. You believe us weak because we have not conquered the stars, because we have not bent entire civilizations to our will. You assume that because we do not wield our motives as vast as yours, we cannot fight. That assumption is wrong. He paused, scanning the assembly, searching for even the faintest flicker of doubt. He found none. Instead, a ripple of laughter coursed through the hall, a cruel and mocking sound that echoed against the chamber's domed ceiling, amplified by the very architecture that had been designed to reinforce the Overlord's presence as the ultimate arbiters of fate. It was Admiral Cale Veros who spoke first, his voice a deep growl that resonated like thunder. The warlord was a towering figure, his carapace like armor gleaming beneath the chamber's pale luminescence, the ridges along his forehead marking him as a veteran of countless interstellar campaigns. He leaned forward, amusement flashing in his predatory gaze. You dare to stand before us and threaten us with riddles? What secret could Earth possibly hold that would stay the hand of the most powerful empire in the known galaxy? He chuckled, shaking his head as if disappointed by the lack of spectacle. You are an insect, human, and your world a grain of dust waiting to be swept away. The words stung, but Ethan refused to let them pierce his resolve. He straightened his shoulders, forcing himself to meet the Admiral's gaze without faltering. Earth is not what you think it is, he said, his voice sharpening into something like steel. And before you decide to burn it to the ground, you should understand what you're truly dealing with. Across the chamber, another voice, softer but no less commanding, cut through the detention. Lady Zara Valen, a vision of icy elegance, observed him with an expression that was neither dismissive nor entirely intrigued, but rather considering. Her silver eyes gleamed beneath the intricate golden coronet that sat atop her raven dark hair, her high-collared robe shifting slightly as she tilted her head, as though dissecting him with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. A bold claim, she mused, tapping a slender gloved finger against the armrest of her throne. And yet you refuse to reveal this so-called secret of yours outright. Tell me, human, why should we entertain your words at all? Ethan exhaled slowly, knowing he was walking on the edge of a blade. If he revealed too much now, Earth would lose any leverage it had. If he revealed too little, they would dismiss him as a fool and proceed with their plans to subjugate his homeworld. He had to play this carefully, because if I told you the truth now, you wouldn't believe me, he said, letting the words hang in the air. Knowing the weight of uncertainty was sometimes more dangerous than a direct threat. You would laugh just as you are now, and then you would proceed with your conquest, unaware of what you were truly unleashing. The overlords exchanged glances, some bemused, others irritated by his audacity. Admiral Varco scoffed, crossing his massive arms over his armored chest. So instead of answering, you seek to stall a desperate strategy, but an ineffective one. Ethan clenched his fists behind his back. maintaining his composure as he turned his attention back to Lady Zyra, sensing that she was the only one in the room who might listen before condemning him outright. You want to test us? Fine. Give Earth a chance to prove itself a trial of intelligence, of endurance, something to demonstrate that we are more than what you assume. If we fail, then do what you will, but if we succeed, you will reconsider your course of action. A murmur rippled through the chamber, and for the first time hesitation flickered in a few of the Overlords' expressions. This was what he needed: doubt, the first crack in their unwavering certainty. Zyra studied him for a long moment before leaning back in her throne, her lips curving into the faintest of smiles. Very well, she said, amusement laced within her tone. Let us entertain the humans' bravado. A trial, then, if nothing else, it will serve as a diversion before the inevitable. Ethan forced himself not to react, though his pulse quickened at the small all-victory he had bought. Time, barely, but time nonetheless. He had taken the first step toward ensuring Earth's survival, but he knew this was only the beginning. As the tribunal prepared to adjourn, Admiral Veros shot him a glare filled with the promise of destruction. You delay the inevitable, human. Nothing you do will change the fate of your world. Ethan met his gaze with unwavering defiance. We'll see about that. As he turned to leave, he could feel Lady Zyra's gaze lingering on him, an unreadable expression on her face. He wasn't sure if she saw him as a fool, a curiosity, or something else entirely. But one thing was certain: he was no longer just a man begging for mercy. He was a player in the game now, and he intended to win. Ethan stood alone in the opulent corridors of Vorith, the floating city where the Overlords had decreed his trials would begin. The walls, made of shimmering obsidian, laced with veins of pulsating energy, reflected distorted images of his own face. As he passed, he was given no escort, no directions, and no indication of what awaited him, only the knowledge that the Overlords had agreed to his challenge, though not out of respect but amusement. The tribunal had ruled in favor of a spectacle, a game to keep their ruling class entertained before they inevitably crushed Earth beneath the heel of their empire. They believed him to be a pawn dancing for their amusement, and that suited Ethan just fine. He had no intention of remaining a pawn. The doors to the grand chamber ahead parted with a whisper, revealing the throne-like dais where Lady Zyra Valen sat in effortless elegance, a vision of interstellar nobility. She was draped in dark violet robes that shimmered like a starlit sky, her expression a mixture of mild intrigue and condescension. Ethan knew she was the only one who had spoken on his behalf, though not out of any belief in his. He had no delusions about that. She was playing her own game, and he was simply a piece she found curious enough to keep on the board for a little longer. He would have to be careful around her. Beside Zyra stood Admiral Kale Veros, his towering armored form radiating contempt, his eyes reptilian and predatory. Bore into Ethan as though he were already a corpse, as though all this was just a brief delay before his inevitable execution. The Admiral did not agree to these trials out of entertainment. He did not see Ethan as a joke. No, Veros was the kind of man who despised obstacles, and Ethan had just become one that made him dangerous. Ethan walked forward, his boots echoing against the polished onyx floor, stopping just short of the center of the chamber, where a circular platform gleamed metallic and humming with dormant energy. He could feel the weight of the audience above, overlords and aristocrats watching from the balconies that ringed the hall, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disinterest. The sheer arrogance in the room was suffocating. Zyra's voice was smooth, controlled, and carried just the faintest hint of amusement. You stand before the tribunal once more, human. Your request for a trial has been granted, though I must warn you, should you fail, there will be no second chances. Your world will not be granted mercy. She tilted her head, observing him as though he were some rare, fascinating specimen in a cage. I trust you are prepared. Ethan met her gaze, refusing to be cowed, as prepared as a man can be when the deck is stacked against him. A smirk ghosted across her lips before she gestured toward the platform. Step forward. The first trial begins now. Ethan exhaled slowly before moving on to the circular dais. As soon as his foot crossed the threshold, the energy beneath his feet surged to life, crackling tendrils of light spiraling upward in a cage of energy before solidifying into translucent walls. Around him, he barely had a moment to adjust before a voice mechanical and cold filled the chamber. Trial 1. The gauntlet of endurance begin. The floor beneath Ethan shifted, the metal rippling like liquid before solidifying once more. He barely had time to process the change before the gravity in the chamber doubled. His knees buckled slightly, but he forced himself to stand straight. He had trained for this. Earth's gravity was moderate compared to some worlds in the Overlord's empire, but the military had prepared him for heavier planetary environments. He could handle this then. The gravity tripled. His lungs seized, his muscles groaned under the crushing weight, and for the first time he realized just how brutal this test would be. Sweat broke out across his forehead as he clenched his fists, forcing his body to remain upright. The Overlords were watching, waiting for him to collapse, waiting for him to prove what they already believed, that he was weak. He gritted his teeth and took a step forward. The gravity increased again. He staggered, his vision blurring for a fraction of a second before he forced himself to focus. Every movement felt sluggish, every breath of battle. He could hear laughter from the balconies above, mocking, cruel, echoing through the chamber. Veros watched with a sneer, arms crossed as though already preparing to pronounce Ethan's failure. Zyra, however, was silent. Her silver eyes remained locked on him, calculating. Ethan knew that if he collapsed now, Earth was doomed. His body screamed for relief, for him to drop to his knees and surrender to the crushing weight pressing down on him. But he refused. He thought of his home, of the millions of lives that depended on him. He thought of his sister, his mother, the people who believed in him, who needed him to succeed. He thought of what would happen if the Overlords reached Earth unchecked, if there was no one left to stand in their way. He moved. Each step was agony, his muscles shaking, his body fighting him with every inch forward. The trial was designed to break him, to prove humanity's inferiority, to remind everyone watching that Earth was nothing but a stubborn lesser world that had no place among giants. He would not give them that satisfaction. The weight increased once more. He dropped to one knee, gasping, his vision swimming. Veros laughed, a deep rumbling sound of triumph. "And so it ends," the Admiral muttered, shaking his head in mock disappointment. Ethan clenched his fists against the cold metal floor. His heartbeat roared in his ears, his breaths ragged. He could taste blood, whether from exertion or biting his lip. He wasn't sure. His arms trembled as he pushed against the ground, his legs refusing to obey, his lungs burning. His body was failing, but his mind was not. Gritting his teeth, Ethan forced himself upward. With a roar of defiance, standing once more beneath the crushing weight of the trial, gasps rippled through the chamber. The Overlords, who had been watching with boredom, were now leaning forward, their expression shifting. The laughter had stopped. Ethan took another step, then another. The moment his foot crossed the threshold of the dais, the pressure vanished, the gravity normalized in an instant, leaving him gasping, his entire body shaking from the sheer exertion. He staggered, but did not fall. Silence filled the chamber. Then a slow clap. Lady Zyra, seated in her throne, smiled, not a smirk, not a look of amusement, a smile that she murmured, her voice carrying, despite its softness, was unexpected. Admiral Varco scowled, his expression thunderous, but he could not argue against the result. Ethan had survived against all odds, against a test meant to break him. He had won. Zyra leaned forward, resting her chin lightly against her fingers, eyes glittering with something new interest. "It seems she knew that Earth's representative is not so fragile after all." Ethan, still breathless, wiped the sweat from his brow, straightened, and met her gaze with unwavering resolve. He had passed the first trial, but he knew the hardest tests were still to come. After effects of the trial still clung to Ethan like a weight that refused to fully release its hold. His muscles ached, his joints protested every movement, and a deep exhaustion settled into his bones. But he forced himself to stand tall as he was led from the chamber. The Overlords had fallen silent, their amusement giving way to something more dangerous, curiosity. They had expected him to fail, to collapse under the relentless gravity of the endurance gauntlet, but instead he had endured. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. And in this unforgiving political arena, even the smallest of wins could be turned into something greater. Lady Zyra had watched him with an expression that was no longer simply condescending amusement. There had been something else in her eyes when he had emerged from the trial victorious, An appraisal, a shift in perception that he hadn't missed. She had clapped slowly, deliberately drawing attention to the fact that he had survived where none had expected him to. That alone told him that she was a woman who played the long game, and Ethan needed to be very careful about how he dealt with her. She wasn't a warlord like Veros, nor was she driven by the same blind aggression. She was a political creature, one who wielded power not through brute strength, but through careful maneuvering, through precision and control. If there was anyone in the tribunal who might be convinced to see Earth as something other than an easy conquest, it would be her, but that also made her the most dangerous player in this game. As he walked through the gleaming corridors of Vorith, the floating city of the Overlords, 2 silent guards flanked him on either side. Their inkle armor was sleek, their movements too smooth to be entirely natural, and Ethan suspected they had undergone extensive cybernetic modifications. Their presence was not to protect him, but to ensure he did not stray from wherever it was he was being taken. He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders despite the lingering soreness, forcing himself to analyze his situation as clinically as possible. The first trial had been about endurance, a test to see if he would break under pressure, to prove humanity's inferiority through sheer physical exhaustion. He had passed, but he knew the next challenge would not be so simple. The Overlords would not give him another test of brute survival. Not now that he had defied their expectations. They would change tactics. The next trial would be one of the mind. His destination became clear as they approached a towering doorway. Its arch, lined with pooling veins of blue energy, the dew slid open with a quiet hiss, revealing a chamber vastly different from the one before. It was circular, massive in its scale, yet empty save for a single raised platform in the center. Suspended in the air above it was a shifting construct of light and data, an ever-changing puzzle of symbols and numbers that twisted and reconfigured in mesmerizing patterns. Lady Zero was already there, seated on a high-backed chair near the edge of the platform, one leg elegantly crossed over the other. Unlike the others in the tribunal, she had foregone the heavy ceremonial armor or ostentatious robes favored by the Overlords. Instead, she wore a sleek, form-fitting ensemble of deep violet and black, a stark contrast to the luminous glow of the puzzle before them. She was not a warrior, yet she held herself with an authority that was unquestionable. Ethan stopped before the platform, his gaze flickering toward her, before settling on the puzzle hovering above. "Let me guess," he said, his voice horror, but steady. "This is my next trial." Zira inclined her head slightly, an almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Indeed, the first trial was one of endurance, but brute strength is not what determines true power in the greater galaxy. Intelligence, adaptability, the ability to outmaneuver rather than simply withstand, that is what matters. This is the trial of the mind. If you pass, you continue. If you fail, Earth's fate will be sealed. She gestured toward the construct of shifting symbols. "Solve the puzzle before the time runs out." Ethan exhaled slowly, stepping forward as the platform beneath him hummed to life. The moment his foot touched the center, the symbols began to change at an accelerated pace, their patterns shifting into complex sequences that required rapid interpretation. He barely had time to process the first series before it reshuffled again, and then again, the speed increasing with every passing second. It wasn't just a test of intelligence, it was a test of adaptability, of pattern recognition at an inhuman level. The Overlords had likely designed it to ensure that only those with cybernetic enhancements or biologically engineered intellects could succeed. It was meant to be impossible for an unmodified human. Ethan felt the sweat on the back of his neck as he forced himself to think, to push past the exhaustion clawing at him from the first trial. He had always been good at seeing patterns, at recognizing the logic behind chaos. He had spent years in Earth's diplomatic service, navigating the labyrinthine politics of the Tan Coalition, where every word spoken, every gesture made was part of a larger game. This was no different. His fingers twitched instinctively as he began tracing the sequence, mentally following the symbols, mapping their movements, identifying the underlying rhythm beneath the seeming randomness. The Overlords had designed this test to overwhelm, but they had also designed it with an answer, And if there was an answer, then he could find it minutes past. The pressure mounting as the symbols spun faster, the complexity increasing. Ethan's breathing slowed, his focus narrowing to the patterns before him. Then, at the peak of the puzzle's acceleration, he saw it, the hidden core sequence buried beneath the distractions. With a decisive movement, he reached out and touched the center of the construct, forcing the chaotic motion to free for a fraction of a second. The audience above gasped as the puzzle patterns reversed, realigning themselves in response to his input. The shifting symbols slowed, then locked into place, glowing in synchronization before dissolving into a cascade of light. Silence. Ethan turned to Zira, breathing hard, sweat beating along his brow. Was that good enough for you? Zira studied him for a long moment, her silver eyes unreadable. Then, with deliberate grace, she rose from her seat, stepping forward. Until she stood just inches from him, he could feel the weight of her scrutiny, the sharpness of a mind that had likely outplayed entire civilizations. Then she smiled, not amusement, not mockery. Something closer to genuine appreciation. Well played, human, she murmured, her voice laced with something he couldn't quite define. You continue. From the shadows, Admiral Pharaoh's seat, his jaw was tight, his reptilian fingers digging into the arms of his seat. Zira had made sure to publicly acknowledge Ethan's success, to force the tribunal to take notice of him, not as an amusing anomaly, but as a contender. Ethan had survived the trial of the mind, but he knew the war was far from over. The hardest battles were still to come. The weight of the second trial still lingered in Ethan's mind as he was escorted away from the chamber where he had bested the Overlord's intelligence test. He had felt their gazes on him, their disbelief shifting into something far more dangerous, calculated interest. He had been nothing but an insect to them when he first arrived, a mere amusement before they snuffed out Earth's resistance and claimed his home world as another jewel in their galactic empire. But now they were watching him. Now they were beginning to wonder if there was something about humanity they had underestimated. He had forced them to wonder, and that was a kind of power in itself. His body still ached from the first trial, the crushing gravity that had nearly broken him, leaving behind soreness that had settled deep into his muscles. His mind was weary from the relentless mental calculations of the second trial, but he pushed past it. He couldn't afford weakness now, not when he had come this far. The guards, their movements precise and almost too synchronized to be natural, led him through the corridors of Vorith, the floating fortress of the tribunal. The architecture was both magnificent and unnerving, dark towering pillars that curved upward like the rib cage of some ancient beast. Floors that pulsed beneath his feet with faint lines of energy, their purpose unknown to him. It felt alive in a way that made his skin crawl, as if the very walls of this place were watching him just as closely as the Overlords were. At last, they stopped before another massive doorway, the intricate engravings on its surface shifting subtly as if responding to the presence of those before. For it, without a word, the guards stepped back as the doors parted with a slow mechanical hiss, revealing the chamber beyond. It was different from the others. The previous trials had taken place in vast halls designed for spectacle, for grand displays of power and judgment. This room, however, was smaller, more intimate, though no less foreboding. The walls were smooth obsidian, but instead of the usual sterile brightness of the tribunal's chambers, this room was dimly lit, the illumination coming from thin veins of violet energy coursing through the walls like living circuits. At the center stood a single elevated platform, circular in design, surrounded by a ring of crystalline structures that hummed with latent power, and waiting for him at the center was Lady Zira Valton. She stood with effortless poise, her arms crossed over her chest, her silver eyes gleaming with something that was neither amusement nor hostility. She was watching him, studying him, just as she had done before, but this time there was an added weight to her gaze. This was no longer just idle curiosity. "Welcome, Ethan Drake," she said smoothly, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. "You have done well to make it this far. Many would not have survived the first trial, let alone the second, and yet here you stand." She took a slow step forward, her movements deliberate, graceful, but endurance and intellect are only part of what determines true strength. There is another test you must face, one that will determine whether you are truly worthy of standing before the tribunal. Ethan inhaled slowly, stepping further into the chamber, his gaze flicking to the crystalline structures surrounding the platform. "And what exactly is this test?" he asked, keeping his tone measured, though he already had a sinking feeling that he wouldn't like the answer. Zyra smiled, not the sharp, mocking smile she had given him before, but something more controlled, more knowing. "This," she said, gesturing to the platform, "is the trial of loyalty." Loyalty. The word sent a chill through him. Of all the things he had expected, this was not it. "You overlords don't seem like the sentimental type," he said carefully, his instincts already warning him that this was a trap. "Loyalty doesn't seem to be something your kind values." Zyra tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. "On the contrary," she murmured, "loyalty is everything, but not in the way you might think." She gestured toward the platform again. "Step forward." Ethan hesitated for only a moment before moving onto the raised platform, feeling the hum of energy beneath his feet. As he did so, the moment he was in place, the crystalline structures around him flared to life, projecting images into the air, moving, shifting holograms that rippled like reflections on water. And then he saw them, his family, his mother standing in their home in New Chicago, her expression weary but strong, his sister barely 20, her eyes full of stubborn defiance, friends, comrades, faces he had known for years, people he had sworn to protect, to fight for. They were not real, he knew that, but it didn't matter. The images were vivid, detailed down to the finest imperfections, and his chest tightened instinctively. Zyra's voice came from behind him, soft but unwavering. "Here is your test, human. You have fought for Earth, endured pain for it, used your mind to outmaneuver those who sought to break you. But tell me, how far does your loyalty truly extend?" Ethan swallowed, forcing himself to keep his breathing steady. "Explain." Zyra stepped forward, and suddenly the holograms changed. The images of his loved ones flickered, replaced by scenes of destruction, cities burned, skies choked with smoke, people, his people, falling beneath the advance of Overlord worship, their defenses crumbling under the overwhelming force of the invaders. Zyra circled him, her voice smooth, patient, but filled with an underlying challenge. "You claim to want to save your world. You claim that Earth holds a secret that should make the tribunal reconsider. But here is the truth, Ethan Drake. You are alone. Your people cannot stand against us. The Overlords have conquered entire civilizations far greater than yours. No matter how intelligent, how enduring, how resilient you may be, you cannot win." The images shifted again. This time he saw himself standing in the tribunal hall, dressed not as a prisoner, not as a defiant envoy, but as something else entirely. He was wearing the ceremonial robes of a diplomat, standing at Zyra's side. He was one of them. "You have a choice," Zyra said, coming to stand directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the faint shimmer of the energy coursing through the veins of her elegant hands. "Pledge yourself to the tribunal, swear loyalty to me, to the Empire, and I will grant Earth its survival. Your people will not suffer. They will be allowed to exist as a vassal state, their lives untouched, their world spared. Or," she gestured toward the burning image of Earth, "you refuse, and the tribunal will wipe them from existence." Ethan felt his jaw clench. He had expected traps, had prepared himself for deception. But this was something else entirely. This was not a test of endurance or intelligence. This was a test of him. Zyra's silver eyes locked onto his, patient, waiting. "So human," she murmured, "where does your loyalty lie?" Ethan exhaled slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He already knew his answer, but he also knew that whatever choice he made here would change everything. Ethan stood motionless, his mind racing even as he forced his breathing to remain steady. The images surrounding him flickered, his mother's face dissolving into smoke, his sister's terrified expression vanishing into the cold, artificial light of the chamber. In their place remained the unspoken ultimatum hanging in the air, thick with its implications. Zyra had made her offer. He could stand beside her, swear his loyalty to the tribunal, and in return Earth would be spared, not victorious, not free, but left to exist in servitude rather than annihilation. It was a devil's bargain, a choice designed to break a man, to strip him down to his most basic instinct of survival, and demand an answer. Zyra did not press him, did not demand an immediate response. Instead, she merely watched, waiting, her silver eyes unblinking, assessing every flicker of emotion that passed over his face. She knew what she had done. This was not a trial of strength or intelligence. This was a battle for his soul, a test to see if he would betray his own convictions for the promise of security. If he swore loyalty now, he would live, Earth would live, but it would never be free again. A slow breath passed through Ethan's lips as he tilted his head, studying her in return. There was something deeper beneath this challenge. Something unspoken in the way Zyra carried herself. She was too controlled, too calm, as if she were not just testing him, but testing herself as well. She wanted to see what kind of man he truly was, and perhaps she needed to see if he was different from the others who had stood before her in this very place, given this same impossible choice. He clenched his fists. He could still feel the ghost of the crushing gravity from the first trial in his bones, the lingering ache in his muscles, a reminder of how close he had come to failing. He remembered the way the Overlords had laughed, the way Veros had mocked him. They had wanted him broken. They had wanted him to fall in line. Zyra had watched it all, entertained by his defiance, curious about what made him different from the others they had conquered. And now she was forcing him to prove it. His voice, when it finally came, was steady. No, the word hung between them like a sharp edge cutting through the silence of the chamber. Zyra did not react, not at first. She did not blink, did not frown, did not show even the faintest sign of disappointment. Instead, she simply tilted her head ever so slightly, her silver gaze unreadable. No, she echoed, as if turning the word over in her mind. Testing its weight, Ethan exhaled slowly, straightening his shoulders, forcing himself to meet her gaze without flinching. I will not serve the tribunal. I will not swear Lord loyalty to you or to them. Earth may not be as powerful as your empire, but we are not cowards. We don't trade freedom for survival. He let the words settle, let them sink into the moment. To what you will. I won't kneel. For the first time something flickered in Zyra's expression. It was brief, barely a shadow of something. She immediately locked away. But Ethan saw it, a hesitation, a shift. She had expected him to waver. Perhaps she had even expected him to take the offer. But he had done something else entirely. He had refused her, not with anger or arrogance, but with conviction. The silence stretched between them for what felt like an eternity. The shifting light of the holograms around them cast eerie shadows across her face, making her unreadable, a living enigma, wrapped in layers of control. Then slowly she stepped closer. Her movements were deliberate, graceful, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter, almost contemplative. You would choose death over servitude. Ethan held her gaze. I would choose dignity. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something else, something beyond the trial, beyond the tribunal, beyond the weight of the empire that loomed over them both. But before she could speak, a deep, mocking laugh shattered the tension like glass being crushed underfoot. Admiral Kale Veros emerged from the shadows, his reptilian features twisted into an expression of pure contempt, his crimson war cloak bow behind him as he descended the steps into the chamber, his heavy boots making the floor tremble with each step. His eyes gleamed with savage amusement as he regarded Ethan, as one might regard an insect that refused to be crushed. Pathetic, Varco sneered, his voice thick with disdain. I knew this human was a waste of time, but even I didn't think he'd be this foolish. He turned his gaze to Zyra, his expression twisting into something sharp, accusing. And yet you waste our time with these games, GES trials, tests, as if this insect could be anything more than what he is. Prey. Zyra did not turn to face him immediately. Instead, she remained watching Ethan for a second longer, as if considering something only she understood then. Finally, she straightened, her regal demeanor sliding back into place. Like a well-worn mask, the tribunal agreed to the trials, she said smoothly, her voice devoid of the quiet intrigue it had carried moments ago. And he has passed 2 of them, Veros scoffed, and he will fail the next. I will see to that myself. Ethan exhaled slowly, the sheer hatred radiating from the Admiral palpable. Veros had always wanted this to be simple: crush the human, invade Earth, move on. But Ethan had forced the game to change. He had done something no human had done before. He had made them pause, and that was enough to make Veros Furious, the admiral stepped forward, his armored form towering over Ethan, his scaled fingers flexing as if itching to tear him apart. "I have no interest in watching you play with your food, lady. Velon, this trial is over. This insect has made his choice, and now he will suffer for it." Ethan braced himself, but it was Zira who spoke next. No, the single word carried more weight than Ethan's own refusal. It was cold, sharp, absolute, the kind of command that even a warlord would not easily ignore. Veros turned his glare toward her eyes, narrowing. "What did you say?" Zira did not waver. "He continues the trials," she said, her tone measured but laced with something steely beneath it. "That is the ruling of the tribunal. You do not override it." For a moment the chamber felt charged, as if the very air between them had become an unspoken battlefield. Veros, a warlord of unrivaled brutality, and Zira, a woman whose power lay not in sheer force, but in the precision of her influence. And then finally Veros took a step back, his lip curled in disgust. But he did not press the challenge. "Enjoy your victories while you can, human," he growled, turning away. "Because when the time comes, there won't be a test left for you to pass, only death." With that he strode out of the chamber, his cloak whipping behind him. Ethan exhaled, turning back to Zira, whose expression was once again carefully unreadable. But before she turned to, she spoke low, almost too soft to hear. "You are either the bravest fool I've ever met, or something far worse." Then she was gone, and Ethan was left alone in the chamber, knowing that whatever came next would be far more dangerous than any trial before it. The silence in the chamber pressed in on Ethan long after Zira had left, the residual energy of the moment lingering like static in the air. His body was weary, his mind stretched thin, but the battle was far from over. He had defied the tribunal's expectations, rejected their so-called mercy, and refused to kneel when given the chance to save himself. That choice had changed something, not just for him, but for the entire game. Zira had intervened, ensuring that he would continue even when Veros had been ready to end him outright. That meant something. She was still watching, still weighing his worth, still calculating whether he was just another fool with misplaced courage or something else entirely. Ethan let out a slow breath, turning toward the exit, his mind already moving ahead. He had survived 3 trials, and the overlords were beginning to take him seriously, not as a threat, not yet, but as a variable. And if there was one thing an empire despised, it was uncertainty. That was why Veros was furious. He had been certain of Ethan's failure, certain that Earth would fold under the inevitable pressure of the tribunal's will. But now there were questions, and questions led to doubt. His guards returned their EX. Questions unreadable. As they motioned for him to follow, they moved with silent efficiency, their armor gleaming under the dim light of Vorith corridors. Ethan matched their pace, every step echoing against the sleek obsidian floors as they led him through the floating city's labyrinthine passageways. He noted the subtle differences in their route this time, turns they hadn't taken before, corridors lined with banners bearing ancient alien insignias, depicting a history he did not yet understand. The closer they drew to their destination, the quieter everything became, as if they were leaving behind the heart of the tribunal's grandeur and stepping into something older, deeper, more secretive. When the doors finally parted, revealing the chamber beyond, Ethan understood why. This was not a room for spectacle, nor was it designed for the amusement of the overlords. It was something else entirely. The chamber was vast, yet there were no towering thrones, no gleaming platforms meant to showcase power. Instead, it was dimly lit, circular, and lined with towering monolithic structures, each one etched with symbols that glowed faintly, humming with an ancient, unfathomable energy. The air felt heavier here, charged with something that wasn't quite tangible, something that made the hairs on the back of Ethan's neck rise. This place was old, older than the tribunal itself, and waiting for him in the center was Zira. Unlike before, she was not seated in a place of power, not lounging in some throne-like structure designed to emphasize her superiority. Instead, she stood alone, unguarded, watching him, with an expression that had shifted into something far more serious. There was no amusement in her gaze this time, no traces of the smug superiority she had displayed when they had first Met, if anything, she looked considering. Ethan stepped forward, his instincts on high alert. "This doesn't look like a trial," he said, even light his voice, the only sound in the vast echoing space. Zaira tilted her head, her silver eyes gleaming under the dim lighting. "That's because it isn't," she replied, "at least, not in the way you've come to expect." Ethan frowned, his gaze flickering toward the monoliths that surrounded them. The symbols carved into them seemed to shift ever so slightly, rearranging themselves in ways that made his head ache. If he tried to follow their patterns too closely, they weren't just for decoration. This was some kind of archive. Zaira stepped closer, her movements unhurried. "Calculated. You forced them to reconsider you, Ethan Drake," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "The tribunal expected you to break. Veros expected you to be weak. And yet here you stand." Ethan exhaled slowly, crossing his arms. "And you, what did you expect?" She studied him for a long moment, something flickering behind her gaze, something unreal. Then she gestured toward the monoliths. "Tell me, human," she said smoothly, "do you know why the overlords rule? Why the tribunal has held power for millennia unchallenged?" Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Because they have the strongest military, because they crush anyone who resists." Zaira's lips curled slightly, not in amusement, but in something that almost resembled pity. "That is what they want the galaxy to believe," she murmured, "that war is their great weapon, but the truth is far more complex." She turned toward the nearest monolith, running her fingertips along its glowing symbols. The structure responded to her touch, shifting, revealing something beneath its surface, a projection, a vision of entire civilizations rising and falling, each one marked with the insignia of the tribunal. Some were species Ethan recognized from his briefings, others were ancient, lost to time, their stories wiped from history. "That the tribunal does not rule through war alone," Zaira continued. "It rules through control of knowledge, the past, the present, the very foundations upon which civilizations build their futures. They rewrite it all. They erase those who do not conform, shape the narratives of entire worlds to fit their will." Her silver eyes flickered back to him. "That is true power, not war, not strength, but the ability to decide what is remembered and what is forgotten." Ethan felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. This was not what he had expected. He had assumed the overlords were merely another conquering force, an empire that ruled through fear and military might. But if what she was saying was true, they were something far worse. He took a step closer, his voice low. "Why are you telling me this?" Zaira held his gaze, and for the first time since they had met, her expression softened ever so slightly. "Because you have forced me to ask a question I never thought I would ask," she said quietly. "I have spent my life serving in the tribunal, playing its games, enforcing its will, and yet in all my years I have never seen a species like yours." She paused. "I have never seen someone like you." Ethan's breath hitched for just a fraction of a second. He wasn't sure if it was the weight of her words, the implications of what she was revealing,